There has been a lot of focus over the past decade on heirloom and open pollinated varieties in the garden. And there has also been a little bit of demonization of hybrid varieties and large agriculture in general. Why? I think it's because there has been a push towards people being able to be more self reliant and also a push away from the corporations having control over the food that is grown for us. What defines an heirloom? And what is the difference between an open pollinated or a hybrid variety? And just to top it off, what is a GMO? And are they bad or even dangerous for us? As gardeners, which one should we be choosing to grow? The heirloom or the open pollinated or the hybrid? That's what we're talking about. Today on Just Grow Something, we will define all of these terms, explore the benefits and the drawbacks of each, and talk a little bit about the push toward only planting open pollinated varieties and why this may not be a good thing. Let's dig in. Hey, I'm Karen. I started gardening in a small corner of my suburban backyard, and now 18 years later, I've got a degree in horticulture and operate a 40-acre market farm. I believe there is power in food and that everyone should know how to grow at least a little bit of their own. On this podcast, I share evidence based techniques to help you plant, grow, harvest, and store all your family's favorites. Consider me your friend in the garden. So, grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something. So, a little housekeeping before we dig into the difference between heirlooms and hybrids. First off, if you missed it, I was recently featured in an article in Women Who Podcast magazine, and I actually made the cover of that magazine. I am super excited for that. I will link to the publication in the show notes if you want to check it out. And if you're on my email list, you already have that link in your inbox from this morning's email. The second thing that I want to announce is that I am thrilled to be a nominee in the Women in Podcasting Awards in the lifestyle category, which is what the Home and Garden falls under. This is a People's Choice type of an award, and this is actually two completely different organizations. Women Who Podcast magazine has nothing to do with the Women in Podcasting Awards. They just happen to kind of coincide at the same time. So it's a People's Choice kind of an award. It's not one of those ones where you go and like I beg you every day to put your vote in every single day, and you get through multiple rounds, and then you get to buy more votes, and it's not like that. It's just one vote per person per category, and the podcast with the most votes wins the category. Straight up People's Choice. There is a double opt-in to prevent fake traffic or fake votes. So if you're going to go and vote, be sure that you follow those steps. You have to enter your name and email to get to the voting screen, and then you enter it again. Plus, I think do a little math problem at the bottom of the page just to be sure that you're not a bot. I will leave a link to my nomination page in the show notes and is also at the bottom of today's email if you are on my email list. Voting started last Thursday, and I'm just excited to see how I stack up against the other nominees. There are 13 of us in the lifestyle category. But there are over 400 nominees across all the categories. They are all women who have podcasts or who are expert guests on podcasts. And if you're not on my email list, you should be. So go to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com and you can sign up at the bottom of any page on my website. And then I also want to be sure to invite you to the Just Grow Something Gardening Friends Facebook group. It is a private group on Facebook. You will find a very supportive community of gardeners over there. I know, especially for beginners, asking questions in online communities can be intimidating, and I've seen people get made fun of needlessly for perfectly honest questions, which is really lousy. That does not happen in our group. It has never happened in our group. I moderate that group myself and answer a lot of the questions personally, but your fellow gardeners are also in there giving good support and advice, and it really is a comfortable place to ask a question or share your pictures of your garden or your patio or to share funny gardening memes. It is also free of sales spam from those weird people that post images of all the mice they caught in a bucket or whatever, and then leave a link to where you can buy the contraption. So, if you need an online gardening community that is non judgmental and will always cheer you on in your humble garden brags and loves a good gardening or food related meme, then check out the Just Grow Something Gardening Friends Facebook group. You'll have to answer a few questions to get in, just so I know you're not a spam bot. And that's it. So I will leave a link to that in the show notes. Okay, so let's talk heirloom versus open pollinated versus hybrid versus GMO or GE. What is the difference between all of these and why should we care? So we'll start with heirloom and open pollinated. So an open pollinated variety is one that self pollinates or cross pollinates with another plant by wind or insect activity. They remain fairly consistent, producing seed that will grow into plants that are more or less like their parent plants. So beets, all of our brassicas like broccoli and cauliflower, carrots, corn, and squashes are all open pollinated. They are all cross pollinating, and so they require isolation in the garden to keep the varieties true to type, right? Beans and lettuce and peas and tomatoes are self pollinating, so they generally don't need to be isolated. Although if you want to guarantee the tomato you get the next year is the same one you had this year, I would put the tomato varieties separate from each other just to be on the safe side. That's what I do. Now, the seeds from open pollinated fruits or vegetables can be saved and they can be planted the next year and remain like the parents, assuming that they haven't crossed with another variety. That would create a hybrid, and we'll talk about that more in a second. So, heirlooms are just open pollinated varieties that have been around unchanged for a very long time. The generally accepted qualification is a variety that is at least 50 years old. Some organizations actually put it higher at 75 years, but in any case, it's old. It's been around for a while. Some of these seeds have just been saved for generations by one or two families in a very specific geographical area, and then they are rediscovered either by a seed company or a seed saving organization, and then they are bred, and now they become very popular types. So think in terms of tomatoes, those are the most obvious when we talk about heirlooms, right? So Cherokee Purple, German Johnson, Black Krim, Green Zebra, these are all heirloom varieties. The thing about heirlooms is there is a lot of variability. So, individual plants of an heirloom variety can actually vary quite a bit in size and shape because these varieties basically represent a genetic pool of sorts that all share some commonality rather than all being one specific type. So, that's why heirlooms can look really wonky one time when you plant them, but then if you get the seeds the next year from a different source, they may perform completely differently. And then if you save the seeds yourself, they may act different from the other two. It's fun, but it may not be very predictable. And that's where hybrids come in. So, a hybrid is what happens when one plant variety crosses with another. Now, in the plant breeding world, a hybrid is the result of pollination of one specific variety with pollen from another specific variety or multiple varieties, right? So, a seed company or a plant breeder will choose parent varieties that produce first generation offspring that have the characteristics that they want in that offspring. So that could be size or shape or color or disease resistance or flavor or any number of traits. It's done in a very controlled manner so that all the offspring are exactly the same. We call these F1s or F1 hybrids, right? So hybrids are good. Just for one example, if you live in an area that is particularly susceptible to a certain plant disease, you can plant hybrid varieties that have been bred to be resistant to that plant disease. So, this will actually help keep that disease out of your garden. Hybrids are actually a really good choice for organic gardening since you're not going to be using a bunch of, pesticides and, that sort of thing. They can provide sort of an extra layer of protection against diseases, which makes your plant stronger, which means it can fend off the pests a little bit better, right? So, and actually, some hybrids also turn out to be more resistant to specific insect pests too, which is one more reason why you might want to grow a hybrid in your garden if you've had a really difficult time getting a specific type of plant to maturity before the bugs take them out. Now, here is where I guess the concern comes into play if you are somebody who is a proponent of self-reliance, because if you save the seeds from a hybrid plant, the resulting plant likely will not produce fruit the same way it did the year before. Hybrids will often revert to the traits from one parent plant or another. And actually, hybrids can have as many as four parents. So um, that is the problem, or that is the argument when you're talking about open pollinated versus hybrids. And I sort of land in the middle of this argument. I see the need for growing open pollinated varieties because we don't want to be reliant on seed companies or seed breeders to do all this work ourselves and for them to have complete control over what it is available for us to be able to grow. So, having open pollinated varieties that we can isolate and that we can save the seeds from ensures that we have a stable food supply. On the other hand, if you have a garden and you cannot grow cucumbers because the downy mildew or the powdery mildew takes out your plants every single year, then you are no longer able to produce your own food anyway. So, why shouldn't you grow a hybrid variety that has been bred to be resistant to powdery mildew or downy mildew in order to be able to actually get a harvest? So, if it comes between not being able to grow cucumbers at all or growing a hybrid, then by all means, you should be growing a hybrid, right? I don't think you can take a hard line on one side or the other. I think, a good mix of both is the best idea. Now that's just my opinion, and that's I'm entitled to it as well as you are entitled to your own. So, I just want you to have all of the information when you hear the arguments regarding hybrid versus open pollinated. Now, here's where it gets a little confusing too. Let's take the Rutgers tomato, which is actually one of my favorites. It is also known as the Jersey tomato, right? The Rutgers tomato was actually the most popular tomato variety in the world before we started sort of having mechanized farming. It was developed in 1934 by Rutgers University along with the Campbell's Soup Company. So it was a hugely flavorful tomato. It was also more resistant to rot than its predecessors, and it became a staple ingredient of not only Campbell's soup, but also Hunt's and Heinz. At its peak, the Rutgers tomato made up more than 60% of all commercial tomato sales, and it was also being eaten fresh in home kitchens, in addition to being processed into soups and to ketchup. It was really a versatile tomato. Unfortunately, in around the 1960s, automation became a thing in farming, and the Rutgers tomato's skin is a little bit too thin for automated picking. And if you were still harvesting by hand, the skin was too thin for it to be very shippable. So farmers and commercial producers began looking for more hardy tomatoes that would store longer and they would travel further with less spoilage. And thus sort of began the change in breeding practices in leaning more towards durability for shipping instead of flavor, which is why I maintain that the grocery store tomatoes still taste like cardboard to this day. But that's why the Rutgers sort of fell out of favor. It was still popular with home gardeners. It just wasn't being grown on a large scale. But there was some renewed interest in this by plant breeders in the early 2000s. They found out that the Campbell Soup Company still had some of the genetic material from the parent plants of the original Rutgers tomato. And so they spent about 15 years working to revive this cultivar. And when they finally released it, it was called the Rutgers 250 in honor of Rutgers University 250th anniversary, which I think was kind of cool. But let's go back a little bit. Notice what I said. The Rutgers tomato, the original Rutgers tomato, was developed by Rutgers University and Campbell's Soup. It was a cross between two or more varieties that was bred over and over again for those specific traits. But the Rutgers that I grew was open pollinated. You can grow a Rutgers tomato, isolate it, save the seeds, and grow the same tomato again next year. The newer Rutgers 50 was also a hybrid, but it's not open pollinated. So what gives? I thought we said that hybrids weren't open pollinated, but the Rutgers was a hybrid and it was open pollinated. What? Yes. So Some hybrid varieties, right, plants that started out as hybrids, are able to be stabilized over the years and become open pollinated varieties. And so you would develop this F1 hybrid, and you can take the seeds and replant them and grow new plants, and then choose the fruits that come from those next year's plants that are just like the parents. And then plant those and do it again. And you do it again over and over and over again. You are selectively breeding that plant to become a stable version and become open pollinated. And that's what happened with the Rutgers. And many of these varieties, like the Rutgers, have been stabilized for so long that they are now considered heirlooms. So it started as a hybrid. It was stabilized to become open pollinated, and it's been stabilized for so long that now it's considered an heirloom. And you can buy Rutgers tomato seeds as open pollinated heirlooms in a myriad of different catalogs. As for the Rutgers 250, well, Rutgers University says that they are currently unavailable for sale because they do not have a licensee to sell the seeds. So to me, that just means that, while it was great as a commemorative project for the 250th anniversary of the university, the newer version of the Rutgers just didn't stand up to the old-fashioned growth and the flavor of the original, now stabilized version, right? Another example is a hybrid apple pushing out a mutant version of itself that became its own variety through propagation and stabilization. And that is how the Blondie apple was created. So it's also known as the yellow gala, and it was discovered by Tom and Bob McLaughlin in Portsmouth, Ohio in 1998. And they were gala apple growers, and they saw this one tree had this bright yellow skinned apple, which of course kind of makes it stand out in an orchard full of red gala apples. And they decided to cultivate it, and the Blondie apple was born. It's a little bit crunchier than a Gala. It's matures around the same time, which is actually earlier than other yellow apples. It's got a good disease resistance to apple scab, and it also stores very well. But it has become its own variety, even though it was a mutation from another apple, which incidentally was a hybrid variety, right? So plant genetics and plant breeding is really fascinating. It's also very in depth. Are you confused yet? Great, because we're going to go one step further and we're going to talk about GMOs, or GE, genetically modified organisms, and genetic engineering. And the reason we're going to talk about these is because I want you to have all of the information at your disposal, especially since these plants are becoming more prevalent. This podcast is all about the why behind the how, and understanding why we would or wouldn't want to plant something in our garden or buy something in the grocery store is part of that. That is also coincidentally why I'm still using Magic Mind with my coffee in the morning, because there is a why behind the creation of that product, and there's a why behind how it works. The creator, James, ended up in the ER about, I don't know, 10 years ago, and the doctor diagnosed him with a heart condition and told him that the two main culprits of that heart condition were too much stress and too much caffeine, particularly the combination of the both. Now, there's plenty of stress in farming, and I love my coffee. And James's doctor told him he had to limit himself to half a cup of coffee a day. So his doctor also suggested green tea because has compounds, that extend the absorption of the caffeine and that give you a feeling of calm at the same time it's keeping you alert, which is why it makes so much sense that taking it with my coffee in the morning instead of in the afternoon with like a standalone shot like I was before works so much better. And it's not just the matcha green tea that's in it. It's got lion's mane mushrooms, and it's got cordyceps and turmeric and all kinds of vitamins and all kinds of really good stuff. And none of it is genetically modified. So you can save a ton on a subscription to Magic Mind, like almost half off. Or you can do 20% off a one-time order by going to magicmind.com/justgrowsomething and using code justgrowsomething20 to try it yourself. I'm telling you, it makes a huge difference in my energy level and my focus throughout the day. So magicmind.com/justgrowsomething and use code justgrowsomething20. Okay, so what about genetic modification? This topic has been sensationalized and demonized, and I have my own personal feelings about them, but let's start with the science. Genetic engineering, in terms of fruits and vegetables, refers to the scientific process of directly modifying the DNA of a plant to achieve specific desired traits. Unlike traditional breeding, which involves cross pollinating plants over many generations, genetic engineering allows scientists to make precise changes to a plant's genetic makeup quickly and accurately. There's a reason that I use the term genetic engineering more frequently than GMO or genetically modified organism. People like to play semantics when they're arguing. And if you express concerns over the use of GMOs, inevitably somebody comes back and says, well, all hybrids are GMOs because you've manipulated the genes of the plant by crossbreeding, blah, 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 blah. Okay, look, that's just an attempt to confuse the conversation or ignore the science behind plant breeding. So I say genetic engineering. There is a big difference between selective breeding of a plant and targeting specific genes of a plant in a lab. Okay, so here is how genetic engineering works in a nutshell. Plant scientists identify a trait that they want to either enhance or introduce into a fruit or vegetable, like increased resistance to pests or faster growth or a longer shelf life or whatever. They isolate the specific gene or genes that are responsible for that trait. Now, this gene might come from the same plant species, or it could come from a completely different one. So, you might have a gene that makes a plant resistant to a particular pest that might be taken from another plant that just naturally has that resistance, right? And then scientists will insert that isolated gene into the DNA of the target plant. So, this process might involve using what's called a bacterial vector. That is a bacteria that will carry the gene to its target, or they use a gene gun, which delivers the new genetic material exactly where it's needed. The modified plant cells are then grown into full grown plants through tissue culture methods. And these plants will contain the new gene in all of their cells and express the desired trait or traits. The genetically engineered plants are then tested to make sure that they perform the way that they're supposed to and that they are safe for consumption and that they are safe for the environment. And then when they've successfully bred these plants, then they will breed them to produce seeds that carry the new traits. Very, very detailed, very scientific, right? So at a high level, genetic engineering can actually help reduce the need for chemical pesticides. It can increase crop yields. But it's also a real topic of debate because there are discussions and concerns around labeling and safety and environmental impact. I would say probably the most high profile um, example of this is the infamous Roundup Ready field corn that now accounts for about 90% of the US field corn crop. And the main concerns surrounding this Roundup Ready corn is basically around environmental health, but also human health and agricultural practices. So, from environmental standpoint, Roundup Ready corn is genetically engineered to be resistant to glyphosate. That is the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup. The problem is over reliance on glyphosate has led to the evolution of glyphosate resistant weeds. We call these super weeds. They can be more difficult to control. They may require the use of even more toxic herbicides or higher quantities of herbicides in order to kill them off. And that just exacerbates the environmental damage that the corn was originally bred to mitigate. The purpose was to reduce the amount of herbicide being used, not increase it. There are also concerns that the extensive use of glyphosate can negatively impact non target plant species, so things other than the weeds you're trying to kill off, and that the insects and the birds and the other wildlife that depend on those plants um, are going to have problems, and that's going to reduce the biodiversity in the agricultural areas where it's being used. Not to mention, we talk about soil health all the time, and glyphosate and its residues can absolutely affect the soil microbial communities. And we know that plays a crucial role in nutrient cycling and soil health. So there are all kinds of environmental concerns. There are also human health concerns. And I'm not even talking about the question of whether or not it is safe to consume genetically engineered foods, because over and over again, from a scientific standpoint, we have seen that these foods are safe to consume. Now, we don't know what extended exposure or extended consumption can do. Obviously, we can't look 100 years in the future. But the human health concerns that are very prevalent right now is the potential health effects of glyphosate on the people who are using it, who are spraying it. So there have been studies that have linked glyphosate exposure and certain health conditions, specifically cancer, specifically non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Even though the regulatory agencies like the EPA say that it's safe when used as directed, Bayer Monsanto has lost court cases here recently that have told us otherwise. So that is a concern. And with that being a concern, there is also a concern about the chemical residues in our food. The presence of glyphosate in food products made from Roundup Ready corn is a concern. So, yes, the regulatory agencies set a maximum level of residue limits to ensure our safety, and I'm using air bunnies here. Um, there are no studies, no long-term studies on the accumulative effects of that, of the continuous consumption of these foods. And then, of course, there are all kinds of agricultural practice concerns, monocultures and crop rotations, economic and market concerns. There's ethical concerns. There are all kinds of concerns that are specifically focused on, Roundup Ready GMO corn. So even though they can provide, simplified weed management and potentially higher yields, potentially, that also presents some environmental and health and agricultural and ethical concerns that we have to be concerned with as consumers. And that is where the stigma from GMO or GE crops comes from. But that is just one type of genetically engineered crop. And it is generally found in processed foods on the grocery store shelves. But there are genetically engineered fruit and vegetable varieties being sold directly to consumers that don't come with quite as many of the concerns, but that also don't come with any labels. So, what are some of these genetically modified fruits and vegetables? The first one might surprise you, and it is rainbow papaya. So, this was developed to resist the papaya ring spot virus. That virus was set to absolutely decimate the Hawaiian papaya industry. And so they developed this one, and it was actually one of the first genetically engineered fruits that was available to consumers. If you have eaten papaya, specifically if you've eaten Hawaiian papaya, but if you've eaten papaya just out of the grocery store here in the US, you likely have eaten a rainbow papaya because it is approximately 75% of the papaya sold in the US. And there you wouldn't have any idea that you had eaten it, right? There's also the Arctic apple, which has been modified to resist browning when it's cut or bruised. There's a Arctic golden, there's an Arctic granny. There are several of them. There is also BT sweet corn, and this one, was that for the longest time there wasn't sweet corn that was genetically engineered, and then all of a sudden they sort of burst onto the scene. This is a type of corn that has been modified to express a protein from bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis. And so we've talked about BT before as something that is used in organic gardening to help um, reduce worm damage specifically. So this corn has been modified to express that protein that reduces the need for using chemical insecticides to be sprayed on the corn for those earworms, for the cornworms. And there are also herbicide tolerant sweet corns as well. So Roundup Ready sweet corn, which is sort of new. There are at least 16 varieties that I know of um, genetically engineered sweet corn, maybe more. That's just what I've seen in my catalogs. And you won't know if the sweet corn that you're buying has been genetically engineered unless you know like the names of all of these and if it's being sold under a name brand. There is also Pink Glow pineapple. It is a pink pineapple. It's been engineered to have pink flesh and a sweeter taste. I believe it is marketed by the Del Monte brand, and it's marketed as a premium product. So you'll probably have to pay more for it too when you get it. And then there's also some varieties of summer squash, specifically zucchini, that have been genetically modified to be resistant to certain viruses, specifically zucchini yellow mosaic and watermelon mosaic virus. Now, these genetically engineered fruits and vegetables are absolutely available in your local grocery stores. They may also be available at your local farm stand, depending on the size of your farmer. But their presence may not be immediately apparent to you. So they're sometimes sold under specific brand names or they're marketed with special characteristics like non browning or whatever. And this is because of the labeling requirements in the US. I don't know if a lot of these varieties are available in other countries, and the labeling laws in those other countries is not known to me either. But I do know in the US, as of 2022, the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard required that foods that contain genetically modified ingredients were to be labeled as containing a bioengineered substance. But that has bounced back and forth. At one point, I think there was some pushback. They were trying to repeal it, and then only California was doing it. And now, it's a mess. As far as I know, because I still see it on labeling when I look in the grocery store, that there are things that will say contains a bioengineered food or contains a GE food. But that's for processed foods. There is no requirement that I have found anywhere to label fresh foods to identify them as genetically engineered. And in case you're wondering, as of right now, there are no genetically modified tomatoes available. It's not that they haven't tried. It's just they've never been very successful. And so they did have one that was called a flavor saver or something like that. And it just fell flat and the growers didn't grow it. And so there's nothing available. But these other ones are all absolutely available in your local grocer. So in terms of home gardening, generally speaking, GE fruits and vegetable plants or seeds are not available for home gardeners to grow. Most genetically engineered crops are produced and sold by large ag companies, and they are primarily intended for commercial farming. One of the reasons because of legal and licensing regulations or restrictions, right? Genetically engineered seeds are patented, and their use is governed by very restrictive licensing agreements. And the companies that produce these seeds generally do not sell them in small quantities that are suitable for a home gardener or even a market farmer like myself. Like they focus on selling to very large commercial farms who buy in bulk. We are just not their target market, right? I mean, the first of all, it's very expensive to develop these seeds, and the distribution is definitely geared towards addressing problems that are more like large scale agricultural challenges, pest resistance, herbicide tolerance, that type of thing, things that are more relevant to commercial farming operations, not home gardeners. Most of your garden center and your seed retailers likely wouldn't sell these seeds anyway, they wouldn't carry them. So they're going to offer you a wide variety of hybrid seeds, but not genetically engineered seeds. So some consumers, like myself, have concerns about the potential health and environmental impacts of genetically engineered crops. There are also ethical issues related to biotechnology and, more importantly, corporate control of the food supply. If you go back to the fact that genetically engineered seeds are patented, there is some argument that says you shouldn't be able to put a patent on any type of a life form. And what have we said a seed is? It is a plant in a little box with a sack lunch, right? So it is a life form. But if we look at it from another point of view, genetically engineered fruits and vegetables can offer several advantages, including reduced pesticide use, longer shelf life, improved nutritional content. In fact, I was a staunch opponent of genetic engineering in our food until I came across the Golden Rice Project, and that was during my undergrad studies. Golden rice is a genetically engineered variety of rice that is designed to address vitamin A deficiencies, which that is a very serious public health issue in many developing countries, one that often leads to early mortality and blindness in young children, or blindness, I should say. The deficiency is very prevalent in regions where diets are heavily based on rice or other staple crops that just don't contain enough vitamin A. So, golden rice is engineered to produce beta carotene, which is the precursor to vitamin A. The scientists that developed this rice in the late 1990s inserted genes from daffodils, and then later on they replaced them with genes from maize or corn and a bacterium into the rice genome, and the genes enable the rice plant to produce beta carotene in the grain. It gives it a golden orangey color. Well, when consumed, the human body converts beta carotene into vitamin A. So the golden rice is intended to be a supplementary source of vitamin A. And it has received pushback from almost day one. It has faced extensive regulatory scrutiny, gone through really slow approval processes in many of the countries. There have been resistance from some groups concerned about safety and environmental impact just because it is a GMO. But it has received regulatory approval in several countries, including the Philippines and Bangladesh, and they are continuing research and they're continuing to do field trials. I just find it interesting that a food that was engineered to literally save the sight and the lives of thousands of people in third world countries continues to face such scrutiny when genetically engineered corn that simply is allowing it to be sprayed with more pesticides, or rainbow papaya and pink glow pineapple that have zero nutritional advantage over the regular ones, are readily being sold to unsuspecting consumers on a daily basis. And yet, this food that could save people has seen nothing but pushback, right? I think it tells us a little bit about our food system and the power of the dollar, don't you? So, hopefully, this episode gave you some insight into what's open pollinated, what's heirloom or hybrid, what genetically engineered foods are, so you can understand the differences and make informed choices about what to grow and what to buy based on your preferences and your values. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for joining me on this Focal Point Friday. I'll be back again on Tuesday for another regular episode of the Just Grow Something podcast. So until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon.